This program, while curated to help you improve your health, contains general advice and should not replace the individual advice of your medical practitioner.
When we talk about nutrigenomics, we're talking about what are the nutritional compounds found in foods that will influence our genes. There's a classic saying that, your genes load the gun and the environment fires it. Very often I see how stress has a huge implication on the symptoms around perimenopause and women who are susceptible. The mind is an incredible tool that has the ability to completely sabotage your health as well as transform it.
In life, it's normal to have ups and downs. But what do we do when we get stuck? I've always been fascinated by the healing journey. Why do some people get better while others fail to make the shift? Welcome to the Season 2 Expert Series, where you'll meet 24 of the world's leaders in health discussing their passions and what it takes to make a shift.
We tend to be our harshest critics.
We are more than the muscle and bones in our body.
Whoa, that's so opposite of what I was taught growing up.
I would like a call to arms for women to know that their intuition isn't lying to them.
I'm Katherine Maslen, and this is The Shift. Hi, I'm Katherine Maslen, naturopath, author, and host of The Shift. In the Expert Series, we share the insight, stories, and expertise of each of our amazing experts. We're talking doctors, authors, naturopaths, researchers, and thought leaders. You may have heard them on Season 2 of The Shift, where we took snippets of these interviews to put them together in the series for you. If you haven't listened to Season 2 yet, I'd highly recommend checking out Episode 1, which will give you an overview of what constitutes women's hormonal health and a sneak peek into the series. We'll provide a link in the show notes. Dr. Robyn Murphy is a practicing naturopathic doctor with a focus in reproduction, preconception and pregnancy, and systems that impact hormonal health. Dr. Murphy has a strong background and years of experience in everything hormones and functional genomics, and is a speaker and researcher with several publications in peer-reviewed medical journals. She sits on the Scientific Advisory Board for DNA Labs Canada and Fern DNA, and has advanced training in fertility care, hormone therapy, and advanced medical herbalism. I loved this conversation with Dr. Murphy, and I know you will too. Let's get stuck right in. Dr. Robyn Murphy, thank you so much for joining me on The Shift. It's my absolute pleasure to have you here. Just to get started, I'd love for you to tell me, who are you and what is the story that's led you to be working in the area that you are today?
Hi, Katherine. Yeah, thanks for having me. I think this is such an interesting topic and great audience that you have. When it comes to a little bit about myself, so I would have to say I have a passion for learning. I'm just a nut around nature, and I'm completely enthralled with the complexity of how the body works. So really from an early age, I was inspired to get into medicine from my grandfather, who was a general surgeon and practitioner. And despite having the plan to go to medical school, you never know how the universe works. So it was interesting. During my pre-medical studies, I took an elective in Buddhism, just out of interest in spirituality and learning something new. And what they taught me, or what I came across, was a little bit on Tibetan medicine and Asian medicine. And coming from a very science background and, medical family, I was completely blown away by this completely different way of looking at medicine, looking at the human body. And I was so inspired, I ended up moving to China after I graduated my undergrad. And there I had a Chinese family who the father was a doctor, and he was a traditional Chinese medicine doctor. And I was fortunate enough to learn about acupuncture and herbal medicine, and more about kind of their views of the human body and medicine overall. So that really just inspired me to get into naturopathic medicine, which is a really cool integration of both, our conventional labs and assessments, as well as we got to learn about traditional Chinese medicine and all these other factors of how the body works and how to really, treat the body and address it from a more of a holistic standpoint.
So how old were you when you moved to China?
Well, it was right after my undergrad. So 2007, I would have been 23.
Wow. So tell me, what was that like, being ejected into that culture? What did you learn? What did you experience? What was it like as a 23-year-old you?
I mean, this just completely threw me for a whirlwind. It was such a learning experience. It was one of the most difficult things that I did in my life, just because I experienced so many new perspectives. One being, a Caucasian individual in the middle of China. I experienced a cultural isolation for the first time, a language isolation, being away from my family. But also, I got to really appreciate what we have in Canada just by looking at the differences that we have, how we approach food and medicine and our family. On the other side of that, I really got to learn a lot about myself, my resiliency, ability to problem solve. Just getting around not knowing the language, you have to be pretty creative. So I had a picture book and everything, trying to get my way to different cities. And just got to meet so many people, so many other travelers from around the world. It really opened up my eyes to so many things in life and gave me a really good foundation, I would say, for the rest of the years to come. I'm still pulling from those experiences and how it developed me as a person.
Now, you're a naturopathic doctor. I know that in Australia, our naturopaths really vary from in the US, but tell me about naturopathy in Canada. What is the practice of naturopathy like there?
Mm-hmm. So, I would say that a lot of naturopathic doctors, there is a difference in how we practice, but they're starting to standardize this in the trainings and the practice and really taking it as an approach to try and integrate naturopathic medicine into conventional care as well as in integrative settings. So what we're starting to see is more of these integrated clinics. And for myself, the way that I describe my practice is more of a functional medicine approach where I'm looking at complex interactions within biological systems like the gut, the brain, the hormones, the microbiome, how all of these interact with one another to give rise to certain disease and symptoms. And then using a lot of analyses, using conventional labs that we would see, just, blood tests that you would do with your medical doctor, as well as functional tests. So looking at more comprehensive analyses of metabolic pathways, genetics, and then looking at this all through a holistic lens. So understanding other components that make up our health, things like diet, stress, the environment, our genetics, how all of this interplays and connects with one another to influence health, and looking at treatment strategies kind of through that lens. So modifying diet, addressing stress, and using a lot of natural therapies, as well as we do have prescribing rights here as well for certain drugs and hormones as indicated. And it depends on the province as well. So there's regulated provinces that are overseen by a particular board, which will determine what we have access to and what we don't. And then there's unregulated provinces as well. So, I think it can make it a little bit complex for patients and, trying to understand a little bit about what naturopathic doctors do. However, it's starting to become more standardized.
Yeah, and I think even worldwide, that standardization eventually will take place. But you're right, there's so much variability on what a naturopath actually is, and the different modes of practice. So for you, with your style of naturopathic medicine, so it sounds like, it's very holistic. You're looking at all the different parts of the body. How would you describe the way that you look at the human body as a whole, rather than, I guess, the kind of medical way of looking at things in isolation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another way to describe this is through a systems biology approach. So I'm looking at different markers to understand how each system of the body is interacting with one another. And so I use a number of labs and functional tests to determine this. So very data driven as well, looking at objective measurements, as well as looking at past medical history, symptomology, and really the story, that creates that person, what led them to the state of health that they're in. And so it's really, when I sit down with a patient, it's an hour of really digging into who they are, what were the scenarios and situations and experiences that led to their state of health, as well as looking at these objective measurements and symptoms and bringing that all together to truly just understand some of these underlying pathways. And I use the therapeutic order. It's a mode of looking at the body and how to treat it that's taught in naturopathic medicine, where we have an order that we follow in order to help to sort of unravel the potential triggers or blocks that is preventing the body from being able to heal just naturally.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me a little bit more about systems biology.
Well, systems biology is really looking at how these complex interactions between the biological systems, so things like our digestive health, our neurological health, endocrine function, metabolic function, the microbiome, all of these systems, how are they interacting with one another to give rise to symptoms and disease? And so when we're looking at this from a relationship in accordance to health and medicine, we're trying to understand how are these systems working in concert with one another to develop symptoms, as well as to help inform us of how we're going to address these symptoms as well. So address them not just from looking for medication and trying to stop that symptom, but trying to understand, what are the perhaps biochemical nuances, the nutrients, the interacting factors, things like the microbiome, our hormones, environmental toxins. How do these all connect and interact with one another to influence our body's response to these triggers? And how do we modify that with things like diet and nutraceuticals or natural remedies, other plant medicines, and ways that we can modify these systems accordingly?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you have a pretty significant role at DNA Labs, don't you?
Yeah, I've been with them for a couple of years now. And since the inception of my medical career, I've been working with a genetic company. And so DNA Labs in particular is a genetic testing company, and they have a number of different panels that focus in lifestyle genetics as well as pharmacogenetics. So this is different than the types of genetic tests that you would get at a hospital that look at disease-orientated genetics or genetic diseases. But my role there as the scientific advisor is really supporting the development of different panels. So the panels that we're looking at are things like nutrigenomics, how do our genes impact our response to different dietary strategies, risk for nutrient deficiencies, even hormones and liver detoxification. I mean, there's just so much that we can glean from these panels. And so there's a lot of research and development that I'm involved in. I have a great team there and a team of interns that are extremely helpful in our research and development. And the other side of it has to do with the clinical applications. So, the what now? How do we use this information in order to individualize treatment? Or how do we use this information to diagnose, or what are the follow-up labs that we need to consider in prevention or perhaps surveillance of certain lifestyle diseases in those that have predispositions and are susceptible to certain environmental factors?
So let's just break it down for people that are really, really new to this. What is nutrigenomics? And can you give us a bit of a practical example of where you might pick up something and what clinical applications might happen as a result of that?
So when we talk about genetics, we're talking about your DNA. So your DNA, 50% comes from your mom, 50% comes from your dad. And essentially, this is providing your blueprint. So this is the instruction manual of how your cells function, what they make, how they respond to the environment. And when we're talking about genomics, we're talking about the study of how genes impact the environment or how they respond to the environment themselves. Whereas genetics is really about how the changes within the genes will affect your response to the environment. So it's easier to, give an example in this. When we talk about nutrigenomics, we're talking about what are the nutritional compounds found in foods that will influence our genes. So, for example, when we drink a cup of coffee, it has caffeine in it. And caffeine is known to stimulate certain enzymes within the liver. So what the caffeine is going to do is it's going to turn on certain genes and certain enzymes within the liver so that the body is able to break down the caffeine. So it can actually accelerate the speed at which these enzymes are functioning. So this is an example of nutrigenomics, where another example of how changes with genes that affect our environment or nutrigenetics, an example would be something like iron. So individuals can be at risk for iron deficiency due to changes within their genes. And so based on their environment, so based on their intake of iron, their dietary intake, their gastrointestinal health, will determine how these genes get expressed and the risk for iron deficiency anemia. So that's just a simple example of how changes within our genes can influence our health, and how understanding some of these genetic mutations and changes can really help us to understand some of these individual nuances of how people are responding to the environment, what types and amounts of nutrients that they need or changes in their diet. Because long term, what we understand is, nutrient deficiencies, for example, can take a while to develop, but can contribute to a whole host of diseases. So knowing this information early on can really help us work with patients to kind of prevent some of these possibilities. So another example that's really easy for people to understand is vitamin D. So there can be alterations within the vitamin D receptor due to genetic changes, as well as the vitamin D transporter. And so in these individuals, they're at a predisposition for low vitamin D. And especially in Canada, we have such a poor quality of sun and 6 months of winter. So our rates of vitamin D deficiency are quite high. And what we find is individuals with these genetic predispositions are at an increased risk for vitamin D deficiencies. Well, when we go a step further, this can increase risk for osteoporosis. And it takes decades for osteoporosis to develop. So we can identify these individuals early on and make sure that we're monitoring their vitamin D levels, and when needed, supplementing the vitamin D to help prevent osteoporosis, as well as potentially, give them some lifestyle interventions, make sure that they're exercising to build their bone mineral density and deal with other issues that we know can impact osteopenia.
So if somebody has a genetic predisposition or a polymorphism or issues with specific genes that have specific functions, does it mean that it's a given that they're going to have a problem because of it?
No, definitely not. So this is really where I say that the understanding your genetic predispositions are empowering information. So, there's a classic saying that, your genes load the gun and the environment fires it. And what this is referring to is that just because there's a genetic predisposition for, say, a lifestyle disease like diabetes, does not mean that you're going to develop diabetes. It really depends on the type of diet that you're consuming, the amount of carbohydrates, and what we understand from research, the type of carbohydrates, how many simple carbohydrates, whether it's processed grains or whole grains. All of these can influence how these genes are affecting the insulin response and the development of the disease.
Gut health is central to everything, so it may be good to get some additional support. Many of my listeners have opted to do my 8-week Heal Your Gut program. In this 8-week course, I'll take you through the strategies that I use with my patients in clinic every day to heal the gut and give you the lifelong tools you need to support your gut health. To join us, go to theshiftclinic.com and click on Programs and Courses. Can you tell me, how do our genes, our genomics, influence our hormones?
I mean, there's so many different pathways that our genes can influence women's health together collectively. So when we look at how genes impact women's health, it has to do with risk for nutrient deficiencies that will influence how hormones are metabolized or broken down or even excreted. We see that there's actual changes within genes that influence hormone metabolism. So how the estrogen is metabolized in the liver and what forms of estrogen are created. This has a huge impact on things like risk for endometriosis, infertility. We're even seeing connections with things like fibroids and breast cancer, as well as we see that genetics can influence our liver detoxification and susceptibility to toxin accumulation, such as endocrine disruptors, and how these toxins can potentially interact with our hormones to influence hormone balance and risk for diseases as well.
So this is where we get into that real individualized medicine, isn't it? Is understanding that for everybody that's exposed to something, everybody's going to respond differently, right? And I guess by checking into some of these genetics and pathways and the ways that people are processing, you can begin to kind of understand how that individual might react. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So, we can have people living in the exact same household and say, for example, they live by the highway and there's a lot of toxins and automobile byproducts that they're exposed to. It doesn't mean that everybody in that household is going to be affected or, let's say, get cancer. It really depends on these genetic predispositions, as well as other factors within their lifestyle. But we see the genetics plays a huge part.
I guess this is why with things like environmental toxicity, it's so difficult to prove exactly why they're a problem and why I guess there's more and more research coming out. But, to this date, it's really been a little bit ambiguous. It's like, well, it could cause that, but because of the nature of the research and the slow exposure, it can take quite a while. Is that something that you've observed when looking into these things?
Oh, definitely. I see, conflicting studies all the time. Say, for example, even when we look at a simple example of fat and heart disease, and we understand that originally, there was a lot of publicity and a lot of research around how fat is a contributor to heart disease. And it came out later on that, fat, it actually is beneficial. It doesn't cause high cholesterol. But the body is much more complex than this. It's neither this black or white, yes or no. It really depends on a number of factors, including our genetics, how the fats are being metabolized, how they're being transported, predispositions to atherosclerosis and risk for stroke. All of these are contributors to how a person's lifestyle and diet will impact their overall development of certain diseases. And when we look at the research itself, and when we look at something as complex of toxins, their effect on our hormones or multiple metabolic functions, I mean, it's hard to design a study that just looks at one variable without taking into the account the reality of our exposures. It's never just one chemical. We're often exposed to over 20,000 chemicals a day. And from a research standpoint, it's hard to look at these 20,000 chemicals, how they interact with one another, how they interact with our hormones and our physiology, as well as our genes and how they impact gene expression, liver metabolism. It becomes quite complex. So this is why it's been difficult, to see very clear-cut associations, but we have enough data, over the last 3 decades that we are starting to see some clear distinctions.
Let's just go back to detoxification for a minute, and in particular around estrogen metabolism, around methylation. Could you talk a little bit about how that works and what are some of the things that people need to look out for?
When it comes to estrogen metabolism, so estrogen is deactivated by certain enzymes within our liver and within the endocrine tissues. And when it gets deactivated, we really want to make sure that it doesn't retain any estrogenic activity, so that even though it may bind an estrogen receptor, it's not causing any downstream effect. When we think about estrogen, it's very stimulating. It stimulates growth and reproduction, but we want to make sure we have a control of that. And so through liver metabolism and processing using these different enzymes, estrogen should typically be broken down into a non-estrogenic form and then eliminated from the body. And the way that it's eliminated is through a number of different what are called conjugation reactions. So this is through things like methylation. People may have heard of this. This is a pathway in the body that is reliant on our B vitamins, particularly folate and B12, but actually a number of different B vitamins and minerals are important for this pathway. So what methylation does is it creates the kind of nutrient that the body uses in order to bind to estrogen, to make it more water soluble, and then it can get eliminated into the liver, out into the bile, and into the stool, as well as through the urine. And so there's different pathways that estrogen will go through. So methylation is one. It can go through glutathione conjugation, sulfation as well. And so these are important ways that the body will help to regulate the amount of estrogen as well as eliminate it from the body. Now, what's fascinating is that there's genetic variations in different enzymes that are shown to alter how estrogen gets broken down. And so this can lead to different forms of estrogen metabolites. So rather than the estrogen being deactivated and no longer having any sort of estrogenic effect, we find that there can be other forms of estrogen metabolites that are shown to retain their estrogenic effect. And there have been studies done to look at the ratios of these different metabolites.
What are some of the genetic abnormalities that can mess with these pathways?
So a lot of them are shared pathways with liver detoxification. So there's two different pathways that we look at. One, or what we call as phase 1 detoxification, is through the cytochrome P450 enzymes. So there's tens of different types of enzymes, but the big players here are related to what's called CYP1B1, as well as CYP1A1, CYP3A4, CYP1A2. There's all these acronyms which represent different forms of these enzymes. And so what can happen is through genetic variations, these enzymes can be more predisposed to get turned on more easily. And depending on what they do and how they process the estrogen, this can lead to changes in estrogen metabolites. So we know that there's a particular mutation that can occur within the CYP1B1 enzyme. And this is the enzyme that's important for producing what's called the 4-hydroxyestrogen. So this is the estrogen that retains its estrogenic activity. And there's been studies that have showed that women with breast cancer have higher levels of this 4-hydroxyestrogen within the breast tissue itself that is leading to more DNA damage and DNA mutations. And so in addition to changing how the estrogen is getting metabolized, we also see that there's genetic variations which can influence the elimination and detoxification, as well as how well the body is able to protect DNA from the damage. So that is related to enzymes that are utilizing things like glutathione, which is a very strong antioxidant in the body. So glutathione helps to eliminate estrogen as well as to protect DNA from these estrogen quinones, which are very damaging to our DNA and have been associated with things like breast cancer.
So we spoke about these genetic factors, changing the metabolism of estrogen. Are there any of these factors that make women more susceptible to going through a more tough time during menopause and having more symptoms?
Yeah, we definitely see that in addition to genetics, there's a big impact on a number of factors which can affect how susceptible women are to PMS, as well as perimenopausal symptoms. So we know that liver function and how well the liver is able to metabolize existing estrogens can be influenced by things such as toxin accumulation, or often what we'll see is nutrient deficiencies, which will impact liver function to alter how the estrogen pathway is being affected. We also see that there's an interference of certain chemicals with how hormones bind to certain receptors. So this can make women more susceptible as the estrogen lowers to having symptoms of low estrogen. So we see certain heavy metals as well as persistent organic pollutants like pesticides can affect hormone binding. What's really interesting is there's starting to be some revelations around the gut microbiome and what's called the estrobolome, and how this can really impact estrogen metabolism and recycling, and how too high of certain types of bacteria can influence risk of breast cancer. And then finally, very often I see how stress has a huge implication on the symptoms around perimenopause, and women who are susceptible to hot flashes, night sweats, often will address stress and address the circadian rhythm, what people are doing before they go to bed. Are they drinking wine? Are they watching TV? Are they doing work? All of these can influence the quality of sleep, as well as the corticosteroids and glucocorticoids, which can affect estrogen metabolism and kind of shift the body away from reproductive health and hormone production to more, obviously, stress-associated pathways.
Let's talk about stress in general. Obviously affects pretty much every system in the body, but in relation to hormones, how do you see stress playing out, and how does it actually change the way that we metabolize hormones or change the way that our hormones work for our body?
Well, I think it's important to even just define stress, because it's not just the typical stress that we think of psychological stress. There's also stress on the body related to circadian disruption and sleep deprivation. There's stress that we see from pathogens and infections, from toxicants and pollutants, even nutritional stress. So the composition of our food and nutrient status, even food restrictions, all can be considered sources of physiological stress. So there's acute stress, short term, is actually shown to improve the cellular response and defense processes and longevity, whereas prolonged stress, or what we would say as toxic stress, tends to overwhelm the compensatory response and shortens lifespan. And when we talk about stress and how it can impact hormones and hormone metabolism, we see how it impacts a number of different areas. So it can affect our sleep response and circadian rhythm. So that within itself will limit the body's ability to detoxify, to balance hormones. We see there's a huge impact on gut motility, elimination, as well as I mentioned, the microbiome. And the integrity of our digestive system has a huge impact on our liver and how well our liver is able to metabolize not only hormones and nutrient byproducts, as well as some of these toxicants that we come across that can influence hormone metabolism. We also see that there's a big impact on inflammation and oxidative stress within the body. And we know that inflammation in general, can impact how receptors and hormones bind together, our elimination pathways, as well as our immune system, and how well we're able to kind of moderate our response to some of these particular triggers, such as infections, such as changes in our microbiome. And we know that long-term inflammation and changes with the immune system can eventually lead to autoimmunity as well. And then finally, metabolic changes. So things like insulin resistance has a huge impact on liver function, and we see a connection with fatty liver. And I see this a lot in women, perimenopausal women, where they'll start to notice perhaps some fat intolerance, right upper quadrant pain, where they're starting to show signs of bile insufficiency and fat intolerance. And this is really just a global symptom of poor liver metabolism, that the liver is unable to properly produce the bile that's necessary for fat absorption, that's important for fat-soluble vitamins, things like vitamin A, vitamin D, essential fatty acids. So it's this downstream effect that will have such an impact on not only hormone metabolism, but a number of different processes in the body.
Can I ask a huge favour? If you like this podcast, the very best thing that you can do to support us is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify. This will help to push us up in the charts, which gets us into the ears of more people just like you that are also trying to make their shift. Now, this show is called The Shift, and what I'd like to know is, have you made any big shifts in your life? And I'd love if you could tell me about a big shift that you've made and how it impacted you.
Definitely. So a big shift that I made, I would say, happened around my last year of medical school, where inherently I'm one of these driven type A personalities. I thrive in stress, but I'm also very sensitive to stress. And in the last year of school, I noticed health effects. I noticed impacts on my sleep, my mental wellness, and I was introduced to mindfulness. I was introduced to the studies from the University of Massachusetts. There's a book called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Workbook by Bob Stahl. And some of these practices were the early introduction into my own path of stress reduction and mindfulness that has influenced so many layers of my life. Not only has it influenced my physical health and mental health, but it's impacted how I show up in relationships. It's influenced my practice and, how I treat patients. It's influenced certain hobbies and even spiritual practice. So that mindfulness and reflection has really challenged, what is my purpose and meaning to all of this from a day to day. So I would say that that's, one of the biggest impacts that I've had. And even just lately, with how things have shifted within the, current climate is community, just really challenging myself about, who is my community? Where is my community? And how am I sort of nourishing myself with human interaction? So I recently joined a biking club. It's just a group of 4 of us, but it's helpful to stay motivated and accountable.
I've got one last question for you. If you could give just one piece of advice to someone who wanted to make a shift in their life, what would it be?
I would have to say that the mind is an incredible tool that has the ability to completely sabotage your health as well as transform it. So I would recommend, if you could make one shift in your life, to really evaluate your mindset and belief patterns to see how they're influencing your life. And the first step would be taking time daily just to reflect. Just to see, what are those thought patterns? How are they impacting your relationships, your desires, your motives? And give yourself an opportunity to be curious around that, of how that may be influencing and improving your health or affecting it otherwise.
Wonderful. Dr. Robyn Murphy, thank you so much for joining me on The Shift.
It's such a pleasure and an honor. I thank you so much for being here.
There was some great information in this episode, so let's make sure we've gotten the key points and what action you can take as a result of this. Taking a systems biology approach, we can look at the whole body and how things interact with one another. We call this looking at the landscape of your entire health at Shift, and it is one of the most important factors for healing. Nutrigenomics is the area that looks at how your environment impacts your genes. You could, for example, have a very strong family history of diabetes or cancer, and if the conditions were right, you could go down that same pathway. But if you eat well, work on stress, and address toxicity, we can stop these genes from expressing themselves through nutrigenomics. Cool, hey? I love these final remarks from Dr. Murphy. Your mind is an incredible tool that has the ability to completely sabotage your health as well as transform it. We need to evaluate our mindset and belief patterns to see how they're influencing our life and our health. Learning is great, but action is better. Here are some things you could do as a result of this conversation in order to help you shift your health and your life. Look at the landscape of your entire health. If you're a fan, you've heard me say this dozens of times by now, but seriously, it is the most important aspect when it comes to healing. Map out a list of each of your individual symptoms. Many of our clients at Shift end up with a list of 20 to 30 individual symptoms. This isn't by chance, it is nearly always connected, and you need to find out how. When you're eating a food, think about if it's preventing disease or causing it. This might seem really simple and it's something that we say a lot, but it is very important. Nutrigenomics dictates that we have the ability to change the trajectory of our health from what we put in our mouth and how we live day to day. Lastly, focus on your mindset. The first step is to start listening to your internal dialogue. Is it helping or harming you? I'd encourage you to go back and listen to episode 9 of season 2 of The Shift, Stress, Mindset, Your Internal Dialogue and Your Health, which has a heap of information on this topic. A huge thank you to Dr. Robyn Murphy for sharing her knowledge with us all on The Shift. If you like this episode, please let us know by sharing on social media and tagging Dr. Murphy and myself, Katherine Maslen, or The Shift Clinic so that we can hear what you have to say. You can find out more about Dr. Murphy at her website, drrobynmurphy.com. That's drrobynmurphy.com, or say hello on social media. In the next episode of the Expert Series on The Shift, we have Nat Kringoudis, Doctor of Chinese Medicine, author, and expert in all things hormonal health. It's a good one, so make sure that you tune in.
Coming up on The Shift.
When you can have faith in your body always working for you, not against you, everything changes. The 101 really is that our stress hormones are there to save us, and they've been designed to do that. That's not your body breaking, that's actually your body working. You don't have to pretend to your children that these things don't happen. You can have these organic conversations from the minute they start to ask you about their body. Children are just like sponges. If they're watching you understand your body, then they're going to follow in those footsteps just by default.
This series is a production of The Shift Clinic. Hosted by Katherine Maslen. Music and sound design by Shade Furlong. Thank you to all of our experts. For more details on them, go to theshiftclinic.com.
We can be. We must be.
The first generation to end extreme poverty.
The generation most determined to fight injustice
and inequality.
The generation that saves the planet
from climate change.
And this is how we will get it done.
The global goals.
A 15-year plan for everyone, everywhere.
With no one left behind.
The global goals are a framework that collectively help us
support the health of our people
and the planet.
At Shift, we are ambassadors for the global goals.
This project supports global goal number 6.
Clean water and sanitation.
Every time you listen
to an episode of The Shift,
we provide a day's access to clean water
for a human in need
in Malawi, Africa.
Water is the foundation to health, and we believe
every human should have access
to clean, healthy water.
So please share this podcast wide
and keep tuning in
so we can impact those who need it the most.